This is really a response video to two of Justin Sung's videos on studying. A very weak system for learning. You really should be focused on something else. I have a PhD in learning sciences from a fancy university. I basically study the research on learning for a living. I'm making this video to clear up some misconceptions his video brings up when it comes to retrieval-based study techniques.
Everyone, it's Justin here again, and I am joined by a very special guest today. We've got Dr. Benjamin Keep here. Benjamin, could you quickly introduce yourself?
Hey, Benjamin Keep. I make YouTube videos right now. I consult with companies on how to create learning experiences. I have a PhD in learning sciences and technology design. And before that, I was a lawyer very briefly for about 3 years before I jumped ship. But very excited to be here.
Awesome. And the reason that we've invited Benjamin on to this is because Benjamin actually made a video in reaction to a couple of the videos that I've made, and I have held off on watching them because I wanted to get a genuine reaction about some of the points here. And so I'm like a little bit apprehensive about watching it. But anyway, we'll have a discussion. I will be just kind of cutting to parts of it. So if you haven't watched the full video yet, check the description down below. And I would recommend that you watch the full thing, like in its entirety first, and then maybe come to this and we can see the commentary and reaction over it. We will be having a relatively higher level, like a more technical dive into some of the points in this video. So if you are more technically minded, that's going to be great for you. You'll love it. But if you are someone that's just wanting that quick hit, the quick tip, you're not too interested in the science or the research aspect of it that goes on behind the scenes, and this video may not be quite down your alley. But anyway, I'll leave it to you, and without further ado, we'll jump into the video.
This is really a response video to two of Justin Sung's videos on studying. One of his videos critiques the effectiveness of study techniques based on retrieval, and the other one advocates for study techniques based on effective encoding. What are retrieval and encoding? Encoding is about putting things into your head. So when you first see a bit of information, how do you get that thing into your head? Retrieval is about remembering or recalling that. Oh, thanks. This is my first foray into animations. Out again. Justin is one of the better people talking about study techniques on YouTube. I highly recommend his videos if you're interested in developing effective study techniques, especially if you're a medical student or an undergraduate student or a law student or something like this. Go watch his videos. I'm making this video to clear up some misconceptions that I think his video brings up when it comes to retrieval-based study techniques. Who am I? I have a PhD in learning sciences from a fancy university. I basically study the research on learning for a living, and I help companies to implement that research effectively. If you understand Justin's perspective on encoding and my perspective on retrieval, you're going to find out they're not that different. Then you are going to have a much better understanding of how to create effective study techniques on your own.
Now, just based on what you said there, I'm going to think. Now, when I made that video in the first place, I thought I'm not going to be able to give the full picture on how everything works. And so I was trying to be strategic in terms of what can I bastardize and what can I not. And based on what you're talking about there, I'm wondering whether you're talking about the sort of re-encoding aspects of retrieval or the effect that retrieval has on encoding or the encoding effects of retrieval practice.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you will see, but certainly the part of this is an artifact of like, you can only make a video about one thing at a time. Like you cannot tackle every subject and all the complexity that goes on in a single video. It's like, man, Justin's video from, I don't know, maybe a year ago or longer, man, it was wrong. It's more like, oh, okay, like if you only watch this video, you might walk away with the wrong idea.
Perception.
Yeah, skewed perspective.
I think I realized that because I talked about the concept and I taught people around the balance between encoding and retrieval and the functions, I suppose, that it has, and also how you can sort of think about them separately, but also how you can view them in a very similar lens. But that video was actually the first time I'd done it at, I would say, mass scale, and didn't actually expect that video to receive quite so many views. And based on that video, I realized that there are a lot of ways for something to be interpreted that was more than what I had anticipated. And so I have since that video been, I think multiple times, been trying to like clarify on those things. But unfortunately, I don't think any of those videos got as much traction as the original video. So I still, to this day, I'm dealing with the repercussions of not having thought through the initial explanation properly.
I think that the work that you have engaged with on this, and that I am currently engaging on this, it is about having conversations, developing conversations, bringing people along with you. So I feel like it's just a consequence of the work of translating research into practice and trying to kind of bridge those gaps, which I find to be kind of fascinating and interesting work. But it's just like saying one thing is not enough. It's kind of create a community that's thinking about these issues, that's furthering the conversation, that keeps on kind of correcting misconceptions and moving on. And I mean, you have to start from somewhere.
One of the things I always think about is that I feel my role is as a research practice bridge. I'm never going to be the best researcher, and I'm never going to be the most experienced practitioner, but I am in a position where I can be spending a lot of time in the research and liaising with researchers and then extracting that. And so for me, what's really exciting is that both sides are really interested in talking with me. Like the practitioners really want to talk to me because they want to see a distilled, condensed version of the research that they can actually use in practice, which I think probably a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of that research is very difficult to really extract into something that is practical. And actually probably I'd say 80-90% of the research that's published is not really designed to be extracted into practice in the first place. It's like, this is the groundwork. We're starting and progressing. And so there are errors from extrapolating too early, but then there's also issues with it not being at a point where like you probably could apply some of these things, at least the principles of it, to adjust your practice. And then you can get some experiential data on that. But then the question is, what, in order to know how to do that, unless you just wait for that systematic review to just be, to come out and just tell you what to do, is very, very confusing. And then on the other side, most of the researchers I meet and talk to, they are very well aware of the fact that they're not practitioners either anymore or ever have been. And so they don't know what some of the implications are like in that gap. And I think in the ideal world, there's meant to be that continuous stream of information back and forth. But in reality, I very rarely, when I do consulting for organizations and companies, there's almost no one that really actually sits in that role. And sometimes the person that sits in that role has really no place being in that role. They're usually the person that just expressed interest in it. And then they were like, oh, that's your role now. And they're like, okay, great. Just another responsibility to add on. So that's an area that, like, a position that I see myself as being in, is to kind of bridge together the research and the practice through like a pretty practical lens. And again, like you said, like create more normative beliefs. I find it it's kind of, it's a little odd to think about, and I can understand why it's happened, but there is this existing normative belief around what learning is and how learning should be that is really sort of odd, because it's actually not very logical to think about learning as occurring that way, yet it is the way that everyone thinks about intuitively. It's illogical, yet the normative belief people have. And so there are, I think, not many people trying to spread the message of correcting these misconceptions out there.
Right. Two quick things before we move on. One, I think what you said before about the research communities and the practice communities is really important, because a lot of times what people don't realize is that the researchers, they're not doing research to help you. That's not why they do research. They do research to figure out why the brain works the way it does, or what happens. And then it's just an offshoot of that, a kind of small subset of that, which is like, oh, this is actually practical, or what are the practical implications of that? And I think in recent years, researchers have, especially in the learning sciences area, have done more of that, more outreach, more like, hey, wait a second, why are our textbooks designed like this? Why are teachers doing this? Why are students doing that? But that is not the primary purpose that most research goes on. That's not why people are writing papers. That's not how people further their careers, really, in a research community.
We should make a disclaimer that that's the case for most researchers. There are some researchers who are focused on fixing the gaps. And actually, correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is always the impression that I've had when I read research, is that there are like, tens of thousands of researchers publishing things, but there's not really actually tens of thousands of people leading the charge. It's kind of like for each concept, there's like 2 or 3 people that are really just pushing the frontier, and everyone else is just kind of filling in the thing that they've pushed through. And so there are actually a lot of studies that I read, and I think, did you really contribute anything with this research, or was it just like you saw a publication gap and you're like, I could get something through the door here, sort of jumping on a bandwagon? And I guess if you're really optimistic, you could think, well, yeah, it's providing that additional body of evidence to continue to support it. But at the same time, I sort of think, well, I just feel like there are more important questions that maybe could have been examined here other than just this thing. And the reason that I'm bringing that up, sorry, I just finished. I've been rambling for a while, I understand, but the reason that I bring this up, I get so few chances to talk about this. I'm just like, this is my opportunity. The reason I bring this up is that I find it really problematic, because like I said before, well, like we agreed on, is that in organizations and institutions, even in universities, there's often not a person that is really deep in the research practice bridging. And so there is almost like a bandwagon fallacy effect almost that occurs with this publication bias, where you have all these publications around a certain concept or a certain branch that's sort of self-validating each other without taking a more critical lens at like, well, this entire body, like how relevant is that? Or is that really the direction we should be going in? But it continues to go in that direction because it has been going in that direction. And then that, because there's so much research around it, it is now well researched or very evidence-based. And then that makes its way into mainstream recommendations. The great example I have around this is learning styles, where learning styles just became this enormous movement and fad. It became like essentially ubiquitous, universal everywhere. Like you'd be an idiot if you didn't know about it. And then we've been for decades now trying to just say like, we need to stop implementing this. But to this day, there are studies that are coming out that say, oh, you know, we're going to examine the effect of learning styles on this thing. And in the literature, like in the background, they say, learning styles is contentious. However, it is one of the most well-researched, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's well-researched and we prove that it's not really like a thing, yet the research continues to publish. So anyway, I think it's become quite dangerous when we look at research through a practical lens, which I think is the trend. Research is no longer in isolation. Like people are wanting to extract more from it to inform their policies or decision-making or recommendations. Anyway, that was my little spiel.
Okay. I still have one other thing to say about something you said earlier, but I want to continue on this train of thought because sometimes obviously people say something is really well researched or this is a finding that is well established, and it is true. But oftentimes when you're reading something, it's kind of like the person that's protesting too much, like where they're like, this is one of the most established findings in X, Y, and Z thing. And that immediately makes me skeptical because I'm like, if you are like trying to say that so hard, then what's really going on? So that oftentimes it gets me to at least check, like, is this legit or not? And as you're bringing up with the learning styles, like a lot of times people, if you begin a research study with a faulty presumption, then that kind of the whole study itself doesn't really count for much. And this is true. Like there is a tremendous amount. I mean, you said there are tens of thousands of researchers, and I think what you said about kind of the diversity of people who are investigating learning and the diversity of perspectives that they enter into, not just ideologies, but also research perspectives. There are like more cognitive science people, there are more educational psychologist people, there are more like kind of anthropological approaches, there are neuroscientists there, and kind of they all bring their own perspective, but also their own methods, their own way of looking at evidence, their own values about which kinds of evidence are most important. And this is, I mean, to step outside for a second, if you're really interested in this thing, like learning is one example of this. This is something that happens in every field. And research, just because something has a paper behind it, and this is one of the things sometimes people ask me for citations in my videos, and I generally am fairly, like, I think citations are important. But the problem is, there's this behavior of like, I need a citation. And then once the citation's there, okay, I feel good. Well, you can find a citation for almost anything. There's just a lot of bad research out there, like bad, like just wrong. They don't measure learning outcomes very well. They don't have a well-designed study. They reach conclusions like way out of whack with kind of what the study design is supposed to do. And so there's kind of no way getting around the fact that you have to grapple with how research is done. Or someone has to, like someone in this research practice role, if learners dig into this enough and they want some of the primary research, like they have to start thinking about this on a certain level.
Like there's a level of, you need to be able to examine and synthesize from the research to really understand what it's saying. I completely agree with you. One of the things that I found was that the people that are always asking for references and citations for everything are the people that even if you give it to them, it's going to be pointless. And the people that don't ask for it, they know how to look it up themselves. And so like, I completely agree. And sometimes there are certain conclusions or statements that are supported from like the amount of citations you'd have to, like, primary sources you'd have to read to understand where that perspective came from is like not, viable. And so for that video, I think the space retrieval one, like people asking for citations, I put it off for so long because I didn't know how to communicate the citations in a way that was productive. And so I crammed in a literature review and just published like a very, very simple, something as concise as possible to just put out there. And of course, like very few people actually read it. And then I chucked the references in, but the references were like 500 lines of just like references. And it's just like, well, you asked for it, but I don't think you really knew what you were asking for.
Like just listing references without any context is more just kind of symbolic because, as you say, like the proportion of people who are going to actually like pull up a couple of these are more like reading out of curiosity because it's not a research community. And even in the research community, people cite references all the time to things that they have not deeply read because a research piece comes to symbolize an idea, and they would just want to say, hey, remember this idea? Yeah, it's here. Or they have to cite someone's going to review their paper and they need to cite that person because they know that they need to get it through review or whatever. Citations are good, but they're not universally just positive.
Yeah. And I think people have this faith in just the fact that if it was published, it must be super legit. But, the peer review process is not bulletproof.
Right.
And
it's important. It's good. It's important, but it is not.
It's not a foolproof thing. And some journals have a reputation for having a peer review process that is questionable. To say the least sometimes. And the number of times where I've read an article and it's given me a reference, I'm like, oh, that's a really important statement. Like, I really want to see where that conclusion came from. And I'll look at the reference and I'll read the original article and I'm like, I'm pretty sure this article did not say that. Let's be honest here. A lot of researchers, when they're citing things like, well, you're not really meant to, but in reality, a lot of the time, they're just reading the abstract as well. And they're just reading the abstract and they'll be like, yeah, this kind of fits, and then they just sort of chuck it in there.
Okay.
And it's like, I'm hoping that no one really catches me out. One of the things that my academic mentor and supervisor told me, which really flipped the switch for me, she said, when you are first writing and first publishing, you want to have so many references because you see it as like a statement of your rigor. But as you become more and more certain and confident and experienced with writing and publishing, the number of references that you really include reduce to only the references that are important and necessary to just get your point across. And there's no point having 700 references because no one's going to read 700 references. And it doesn't matter if you have a certain point and next to it, you've got like 7 lines of like just reference names, unless you're doing like a systematic review and you have to actually specify it. But just the way that people view, I think, references is they see it as almost like this mystical thing, like this thing that just exists. As long as it's labeled to it, it has this like stamp of approval, like it's valid.
100% true. Actually, one last point on that, and then I want to get back to this one other thing. But there's research, and I would have to actually find the citation. But if you look at papers that are retracted, so there's a website called Retraction Watch. It looks at papers that are retracted, and they're doing good work. They're doing important work, but it is amazing. Like, nothing happens after a paper is retracted. Literally nothing. I have a video on my channel. It's no one watches it. It has nothing to do with learning, but it is basically about like how I hoodwinked myself by going down this rabbit hole and like thinking, oh, this guy is behavioral economist, famous dude, did lots of big studies, and then there are just so many problems with he's published for years and years. For probably 30 years, he had a huge career. And then they kind of he quietly left his university after there were some problems raised with his papers. But the problems are like, hey, look at your sample size, look at your mean. You can't get this mean from this sample size without having some kind of outrageous things going on. And so it's like, well, and then it becomes even harder to interpret these papers because it's like, I do think there's some value still. Like, I think some of his ideas are still well supported from some other papers as well. But how much am I being influenced by these papers that are now kind of under a pretty high degree of suspicion?
Yeah. A very similar thing has occurred in the inquiry-based learning space. I feel like, inquiry-based learning has not a lot of like high quality research. Like, methodology is often extremely there's even studies on the level of variation of execution of inquiry-based learning. And now you've got these meta-analyses saying, well, it doesn't really seem to have much of an effect. And in some cases can even be detrimental, but it's like, well, are the principles or the theories behind it like actually fairly valid, and are components of it supported in itself? Like, it is true, but it's just that the research quality is so variable, and it's so not, there's no standard for it, that it's developing this bad rep.
There's also this question of like, how hard is it to do a task? How hard is it to this is going to come up in the video in a little bit, but like flashcards. Flashcards are a really easy thing to do. And in the same way, like there are some other techniques like doing free recall techniques or doing other things that it's like, these are easy to do and they are easy to test. If you are going to design, say, a project-based learning scheme or an inquiry-based kind of thing, the number of decisions that you have to make that all have to be going well is just there's a lot, and there's a lot of areas where you could screw up, and so that makes doing the research in that area a little bit more challenging, I think. The last thing I wanted to say, sorry, is when you're talking about these naive ideas and intuitions about how we learn and how illogical they are, there's this idea. He focuses on physics education. DeSessa, who has come up with this idea of knowledge in pieces, which is basically like our naive intuitions about physics, which we get through various interactions in the physical world and maybe early interactions with other people. They're kind of like little pieces that are separate, that when we go to answer a question or think about something, we pull together to kind of come up with some kind of coherent thing. But individually, they are can be at least internally inconsistent. And the same thing is going on with learning, where if you look at like, let's see, like learning styles is really inconsistent with the kind of retention chart, where the like you learn 20% of what you see, or 30% of what you see, 20% of what you hear, whatever, all that kind of stuff. And so a lot of these kind of core ideas, like if you start thinking about them for more than 10 seconds, if you don't just accept them, then you see that it's just a mishmash of different stuff.
This is not a good sign for the conciseness of this video,
yes,
given that
I
we're a
apologize.
minute and 17. No,
but talk a lot. I'm sorry.
No, but I love it. And look, here's what I'm thinking, right? Like, people that are watching this video, is that I said in advance, we're going to go a little bit deeper on this. So if it's not your cup of tea, that's fine. That's all good. Feel free to move along. But if this is a type of discussion that honestly, like, it's very hard to access this kind of insight about things. Researchers don't like talking about this. Practitioners often don't even really know about what goes on in some of the nuances here. And at the end of the day, like, individual learners are impacted. And I feel like knowing why certain people have certain beliefs and knowing how people can be misled and understanding that gives more credibility to the alternative ideas. It's like, here are the reasons why you could have been misled, or you might have these misconceptions and things, and just spreading light on that. I think if even just, like a few thousand people watch this video, I think that's a few thousand more people that can maybe spread that message along. So for me, I think this is it's good. I think it's doing a service. Anyway, let's just jump back into this.
Yes, let's start with some of the basics here, which Justin goes over really well.
Here's how this works. Some of this information that initially came in through sensory pathways goes into our working memory, and then from our working memory, where you're going to be spending a lot of your time when you're manipulating the information, but it's not a good place to hold onto it, because the working memory will also forget information relatively quickly in the span of sort of seconds to minutes.
I think if I were to do this video again, I probably wouldn't have separated sensory memory and working memory, because I feel like it added additional confusion, and I would have just stuck with the idea of information. And this is the way that I teach it now, is I just say there's information in, and it goes into your brain, and then it's processed in some way that leads to it being encoded in your long-term memory. I mean, because I felt like it opened up a can of worms to talk about the idea of sensory memory versus working memory, and then sort of differential levels of decay, and also the debate around what is working memory even? Is that even a thing? And, what is the relationship? So I just felt it was, quite messy.
Yeah, I mean, what I do is, I don't include the sensory. You notice I started your clip, I think, after you had already talked about the sensory memory. Yeah, I mean, I think I just do working memory and long-term memory and leave it at that.
Different. Your
the reason I included it was because I wanted people to understand that, intention alone does produce a beneficial effect on retention, but that effect is relatively short-lived, and it's not particularly scalable or sustainable. And so that's why I decided to do it. But in retrospect, the idea is just quite complicated to try to communicate.
Well, I mean, I think it's also important to know that, like, there's a, I mean, at least I think I'm correct in saying this, but there is a difference in, like, what you perceive is not necessarily what you are working with in your memory, right? Like, you can imagine things that are not being perceived, right? And you might be kind of staring off into space, but working with something in your working memory. So it's kind of, I mean, I do think it's fine. I think it's a reasonable thing to do. But yeah, I agree. Like just from a explanation standpoint.
Things as well, but it will forget things much more slowly. It will forget things in the span of hours to even months. And it depends on how strongly it was encoded in this process here.
My little tiny addition is just to say that memories in the long-term memory system do not just kind of disappear. They don't go away like they do in your working memory. So if it's stored in long-term memory, the main problem is how to get access to it again. How can the brain retrieve and find the memory again? So what's Justin's beef with active recall?
Active recall and spaced repetition is inherently...
This is the biggest regret that I have. When I talked about the idea of active recall and spaced repetition, I didn't realize it initially. And there was a bit of sunk cost fallacy because when I reviewed the video, I was like, I really should have added more about this. The biggest regret I have is not clearly differentiating active recall versus spaced repetition and the usage of active recall or recall-based techniques and the usage of spaced repetition separately. And because I grouped active recall and spaced repetition together, because it is often grouped together in popular mainstream sort of things, like to this day, I continue to get people saying like, what's the issue that I have with active recall? And it's like, oh crap, like that's not really the point. Actually, the point I had was when you are using and relying on, spaced repetition and active recall as your primary form of revision, which is operating at a low order, like exclusively. And then that is essentially like your entire system. This is probably the biggest problem that I have with my own video. Anyway, I don't know what you're going to say about this, but I will just continue.
We're actually here just for Justin to critique his own video here.
It's been a long time since I watched this, and now that I'm looking at now that I've looked at this again, after having spent the last year kind of answering questions and refining and clarifying, again, like there are certain things that I've taught so many times, and I never realized that it could be problematic until I taught it to 100,000 people. And then I realized, oh crap, like actually there's this whole permutation branch that I just didn't happen to encounter because my sample size was only like a few hundred students that I taught this to before. So anyway.
Very repetitive. In fact, that's kind of the whole reason it works, is that it's repetitive. A lot of the students that are using spaced repetition, active recall based systems will find that it's not actually working as well as it seems like it should be working. It's not giving them the results that they've kind of been promised, that they expected to get. It can be extremely monotonous and incredibly tedious, very, very time consuming, and in fact, actually pretty demoralizing if you're not getting the results.
He basically says active recall is okay, but not that helpful. And all it's doing is really helping you to move these forgetting curves kind of longer and longer and longer. But that you really should be focused on something else. It seems like that contradicts what I say in this video. Free recall is one of the most powerful and basic study strategies there is, but it doesn't. The thing that he is criticizing is actually not the thing that I am advocating for. Let's dig into the language he is using because I think this is really, really important. The technique that he's criticizing is
a really common technique that a lot of people are using. It's easy to use, very easy techniques to learn. Pretty much anyone can pick it up. It doesn't have any real learning curve.
He mentions flashcards a number of times.
Flashcards, and Anki. Flashcards.
And he uses this term revision or revise to talk about the recall repetitions.
Revise this information, repeat this information, repetition and revision.
Now what he's talking about is called a spaced retrieval system. And the term in the literature that I did it and I was like, I think
spaced
doesn't SRS stand for spaced retrieval system? And
then spaced retrieval.
I thought spaced repetition system maybe.
So this is So here's one of the things I realized: spaced retrieval is the proper term. It's retrieval practice. It's retrieval. It's the word is retrieval. Like that's ubiquitous. In the mainstream space, people just know it as spaced repetition. I don't know where that originated from, but people understand it as spaced repetition. So I call it spaced repetition when I talk about it in public.
Right.
But if I do writing about it, or if I'm publishing about it, or if I'm talking to people that know about the science behind it, I call it spaced retrieval. So you're right. It is actually spaced retrieval system.
I was kind of confused when I was editing, and I was like, wait, maybe I just made a mistake?
No. Yeah, you were right.
It's funny how. I mean, this, the more that we go along this video, we'll see. But like, this is another aspect of how research gets translated into practice is the language that people use. And sometimes, there are anything that you can think happen will happen. Like a word that's used in the research community to mean one thing can mean something else in the practice community. or various. I mean, there are various research communities, various practice communities. A thing that words that get used in the research community sometimes never actually make it out to the. You can have two different words for the same exact thing. Or I mean, everything that can go wrong does go wrong. And I do think that paying attention, especially if people are, I don't know if listeners or viewers here are going to are reading research, but paying attention to the language that people use, because it's really easy to get confused and to think that they mean something different or the same when they don't.
Yeah, the number of times, and especially early on, before I realized that there are lots of synonyms, I go down this path and I'd be like, oh, there's not really a lot of research on this, and I'll spend a lot of time, and then I'll just stumble across, one connected article that uses a different term, and I search for that term, and it's like, oh, okay,
yeah,
like
here it is.
That is, the number of times that has happened, the number of dozens of hundreds of hours I probably would have saved on searching for things if I just knew to scope the keywords properly before I started. I guess this is why research skills are important. But anyway.
Retrieval practice sounds almost the same, doesn't it? What he is talking about are apps like SuperMemo, Anki, Quizlet, Memrise, all of these flashcard apps, and there's a million of them out there. So he is critiquing a very specific form of retrieval practice. And he is not talking about things like free recall or other more effective retrieval-based techniques. I also think flashcards, I mean, I don't know, I made that assumption terribly.
No, you're absolutely right. No, you're completely right. So in my program, actually, one of the first things I teach people is how to do spacing correctly and different forms of retrieval using interleaving principles. And that's one of the first things I teach, because the idea is that encoding requires a more complex series of cognitive skills. Like you say, there's lots of micro decisions that have to go well in order to be able to do the first pass encoding at a level that is high quality. And so as a result, especially if you're doing it at a higher order, it takes time to build that skill to the point where it's really going to make a decent impact. And so during that entire time, the net at the bottom of the cliff is going to be gap finding and testing from these different angles and actually being able to do the retrieval practice. So one of the first things I get people to do is understand how they can do effective spaced interleaved retrieval. I call it SIRs. And if you can do effective spaced interleaved retrieval, for most people, that just fills the gaps. And then you've got a great, steady, relatively error-free platform that you can then start building on to slowly work on optimizing all those higher order learning strategies. So that's completely right. And again, that's one of the things that I kind of regret is not really clarifying the difference between that, because it created some issues, because I started creating videos later that talked about different, more effective forms of retrieval, and people are like, well, aren't you kind of against this? And it's like, I'm not, but I can also see why you'd think that. And so, but at this point, am I going to re-record that video? No. So,
and the reason is that they focus on isolated, decontextualized facts. They do not encourage synthesis or knowledge reorganization inside the brain. They do not encourage you to compare or contrast things with one another. They do not encourage you to apply things in new contexts. So for all these reasons, flashcards are a very weak system for learning. Let's pay attention to these ideas, shall we? I think the most effective studiers either do not use flashcards or use them very sparingly. So what does Justin recommend that people do instead of using flashcards? He wants people to encode more effectively. He thinks people are not very effective at remembering information when they first hear it. They're not trying to understand the information deeply enough, and they're kind of revving their engines a bit because they're so focused on getting the information into their flashcard app that they're not actually paying attention to the information in the first place. Now, it's interesting that he uses this term desirable difficulty. Desirable difficulties are things that make... there's a point that after some people were commenting on the video, and I had rewatched, I can't remember if it was after you contacted me or before, but I had rewatched portions of your video again, and you say something in there that I wish I would have included in this video, which is that you can't retrieve something that's not there. And I noticed, I mean, if you pay attention to this when you're learning, because I mean, I have used flashcards in the past. And I still, like, if I was going to learn a language, I might use some flashcards in the beginning. But I've had this experience before where if you're on the flashcard app and you put it in and you miss it that first round, and then it's like with Anki or whatever, it'll prompt you again in, I don't know, 10 seconds or 1 minute, depending on your settings, or 30 seconds or whatever. And it's like, and then you're like, okay, prompt me again, you know? And it's like, well, did you do anything? Like, the question is, why did you not know that? And just being prompted again 30 seconds later is not really going to materially change what you know. If all you looked at, oh yeah, this is supposed to be that. Okay, that's it. So that's the only other extra bit of kind of what you might call encoding that you did, is like, oh yeah, this is supposed to be, X is supposed to be Y. Okay, I'll remember that next time. And I think that is an important point that, yeah, I wish I would have emphasized in this video, or I wish I would have excerpted, because I think, yeah, I mean, it goes along with what you are saying, goes along with what I'm saying, but yeah.
There's another video that I made around, the same, exactly the same thing that happens, but with people doing practice questions and practice getting, looking at the answer sheet. They'll look at the answer sheet and be like, oh, I knew that. And then it's, well, if you knew that, you would have gotten it right. The fact that you didn't get it right. And a lot of people will say, oh, I just made a silly mistake. Well, it's like, it's a silly mistake if it happens once. But if you're making silly mistakes all the time, it probably means that they're not silly mistakes. And so people confuse their ability to understand an answer with their ability to retrieve the answer. And one of the dangers is that, if you're not confident with your answer to begin with, that probably already indicates that there's a gap for you to explore. Whether you got it right or not, even if you got it right, you might have just gotten lucky that single time. Yep. And one of the things with flashcards that I think that happens a lot is people don't really see the difference between cued versus free recall. And so what happens is they just build pattern recognition for the very specific cue of that flashcard. They'll read the first 3 words, remember what that flashcard was, and they'll be able to recall the thing without really having to do any of the actual type of retrieval process that you would need to do if assessed in any other context. And so all you'd have to do is simply change the wording of that initial card, and now suddenly you can't recall that information anymore. And so there's, and it creates this illusion of confidence with it. And people can be like very, very confident. They're like, oh, I'm smashing through my flashcards. Like, it's only taking me 2 seconds to do a single flashcard. It's like, you can't even read the question and think about it in 2 seconds. If you're doing it in 2 seconds, it means that you're not thinking about it at all. Like, that's not useful at all unless you're tested on that very flashcard, so it creates this illusion. Anyway, yeah.
For sure, yeah, definitely. Make learning harder in the short term, but result in longer lasting, durable, more flexible learning. The classic examples of desirable difficulties are spaced practice, interleaved practice, contextual variation, and testing. So spaced practice is when you space your practice sessions out or space your studying sessions out. Interleaved practice is when you mix up problem types that you're working on or category types that you're working on. Contextual variation is where you see ideas in different contexts and are forced to, say, apply them in different contexts or vary the situations that you're practicing something in. Testing, that's just testing. There are still some things we don't know about why these techniques work, but the research consensus is that part of what makes all of these techniques work is retrieval. With spacing, you have to use retrieval because you've forgotten what you were learning and you need to remember it again, so that strengthens the retrieval path.
So here's a question that I have. See, is it that the commonality between them is the retrieval, or is the commonality between them the generative effect of learning on them? And the reason I ask that is because there are some studies that are done on the idea of self-explanations, and it's kind of had a research dearth over the last, I don't know, like, there were a few studies on it, like quite a long time ago, and there hasn't really been too much going on the last sort of 7 years or so. I'm not sure why, because I thought it was very promising. But, they looked at the idea of, how can you facilitate self-explanations? And this was from an educator approach. Being able to do a guided self-explanation versus being able to do a spontaneous self-explanation. And the idea was that when you do a spontaneous self-explanation, you are able to have more generative effects of learning, and therefore your learning quality is going to be better and it's going to be stronger. And that seems to be, arguably, there is a level of retrieval that's happening already, like straight off the bat, and that you're taking information and you're immediately trying to retrieve it and synthesize it at a higher level on the spot to be able to create your self-explanation. But when people think about retrieval, especially retrieval as retrieval practice rather than retrieval as a cognitive phenomenon in a way, or process. That's not usually how people are thinking about retrieval. People are not normally talking about retrieval as in like literally consuming, immediately thinking about it and manipulating that. So I have this question mark. So, is it the retrieval that is the thing, or is it the fact that they are engaging in this generative cognitive process I
think one thing, again, always coming back to the language issue, is what do we mean by retrieval versus encoding? And so, like, someone had asked me that question a little while ago in a comment, and one way of thinking about it is to think about it like, I mean, this is kind of how it's operationalized a lot in the research studies, and obviously you can speak up if you disagree with me, but from what I've read, is that a lot of times encoding is when you have the material right there with you and you are looking at the material, right? Like, and retrieval is when you don't have the material with you. Like, that's a lot of times in these experiments, that's one of the key differences from a practical perspective. You can also think about, when, it almost sounds like to me when you talk and when I've seen some of your videos that, encoding is, equating with this idea of elaboration or kind of with not necessarily the practice of elaboration, but kind of these kind of higher level restructuring of your memories, right? Like it's kind of like in a flashcard context, you're kind of putting something in there and it's just sitting there, right? And as you said, you're basically training your brain to retrieve that at a particular given cue or given context to retrieve it. If it is kind of quote unquote encoded properly in your long-term memory, then it is connected and integrated with lots of other information and concepts and ideas and contexts at a higher level. And so that is what is enabling you to use the information effectively. But it is. I do think that retrieval is, if you look at the research on forgetting and why people forget things, this is one of Robert Bjork's phrases, right? Retrieval is a memory modifier, right? Everything like encoding, I mean, differential attention, retrieving things, reorganizing things, how you initially read something, where your focus is, like all of these things affect your memory for something. I do think maybe we can dig deeper into this in some point and both go read some stuff and come back and talk about this. But I do think that on the whole, retrieval is at least an unimportant underlying process that is making these techniques effective.
I completely agree. When I talk about encoding, I usually talk about it in terms of the quality of encoding. And so, when I talk about encoding, it's the way that I'm viewing it, and this is the way that I have understood it, but actually correct me if I'm wrong and that I've misunderstood it, is that encoding is actually just any process that is taking information and shunting it into your long-term memory, whether that's to a high quality or not. And if that's sort of decayed very quickly, then it probably indicates that it was done to a lower level of strength. And this is kind of where sort of constructivist models would come in, which is contentious in itself. But that if you have encoded it and the structure in which it sits in from an architectural point of view is that of a higher order knowledge structure, something that's more integrated or relational, that correlates with having a longer, more meaningful retention of the information. And so you could say that the processes that led to that type of knowledge structure would be considered like of a higher quality, or which correlates with the higher order learning and higher order thinking, that kind of whole space. And so when I talk about encoding, it's like, well, you could encode it really anyway. It's not that encoding is hard, it's just that encoding to a high quality is difficult. And when I say high quality encoding, I am generally referring to higher order thinking leading to higher order learning outcomes that generates higher order knowledge structures. And when I say higher order learning, I am referring to Bloom's revised taxonomy there as guidance. And in terms of knowledge structures, I am referring to solo taxonomy as guidance, even though I know that that's not really how they were designed to be used, but I think it's still relevant to use that way.
And the other important point here as relationship to learning is that you want your memory to change. Like, we think, like in the eyewitness scenario, or like we're like, oh no, like I have this memory about this argument with my spouse or something, and like I want to be able to remember it accurately or something. But with learning, it is not a bug, it is a feature. You want to be transforming your learning because you do not know when something is going to be, I mean, you have some idea, but you do not know necessarily when an idea is going to be useful.
Yeah, that conditional
And
and
so
contextual knowledge parts. Yeah.
Yeah, you want to be able to be like, oh wait, does this apply in this context? Okay, now that I've used it here, well, I'm gonna like that helps me to kind of see that this idea is deeper than I thought, or more widely applicable than I thought, or what have you. So it's not bad to modify the memory. It's a good thing that the memory is modified. Obviously, you don't want to remember things that are false. Calibration, the feedback, the kind of, I mean, that's also a part of the learning process. Like, you don't want to overgeneralize, you don't want to undergeneralize.
Yeah, and some of the most important concepts for learning require you to be constantly modifying and retrieving it to be able to understand it to the level of depth that you need to really see the right perspective. And that's the whole field of threshold concepts research, which I don't think I want to get into right now. But yeah, so it's a very important feature. Yeah, it's not like you said, it's not a bug, it's a feature.
Relieving some of the same things are going on. You have to activate different association networks alternately as you are looking at different kinds of problems. With contextual variation, again, you are kind of departing from a practice and then coming back to the practice again. So it involves some retrieval, some recall, some memory, and the same is true of testing. And I have a bunch of videos on these getting more into detail in the description. So if flashcards are not effective, what is effective retrieval practice? Well, this is where Justin Sung's video on encoding comes in.
As soon as possible, we want to just jump to higher order learning. And that is something like applying, but more so things like analyzing and evaluating the ideas. It's not just about having one idea and then just understanding that idea really, really well and focusing on understanding that idea. It's about taking that idea and then looking at it.
I just realized? I never realized this before. In the background here, I'm actually mining Ethereum. While this video is playing. I just realized that. Yeah, this is just me mining Ethereum in the background. Oh my God, I never realized that. Anyway.
To another idea and comparing and contrasting between them. But not just one or two, but multiple different ideas and seeing the relationships between them. And then the next step, evaluating. This is about not just comparing and contrasting the ideas, but it's about figuring out how we can judge them, how we can prioritize them. In order to do correct encoding, we always need to try to relate the information to each other.
Yeah, it should be higher order
and to the bigger picture.
Encoding, not correct.
So it requires synthesizing concepts, reorganizing concepts, applying ideas to new contexts, and comparing ideas to each other. Sound familiar? This advice doesn't just apply to encoding, it applies to retrieval as well. If your retrieval practice does not have these things, it's just not going to be that effective. Spaced repetition apps get the spacing part, but they miss out on all this other stuff, and that's why they're not terribly effective. When you're thinking about retrieval, one of the questions you could ask yourself is, what is an effective way of testing my skill? And this is where a lot of the research on memory bleeds into the research on deliberate practice.
I just have to yell out at the moment, just this thing with the software that's marketed for learning. Just because it is marketed a certain way doesn't mean that it's actually designed to work. Like, a lot of these software companies do not have educational learning expertise. It's just a series of software developers that had some random ideas about how they should do learning, and they decided that they could hire someone that knows equally little about learning to do the marketing for them, and now they just sell it as a learning software. But, like, it's just...
So,
yeah.
When you were talking before about some companies not really having someone in this like research practice role, and when I was in grad school, looking for jobs, and I was like looking for ed tech kind of jobs, and it is amazing to me how many job openings there are for software developers in ed tech companies, and how few jobs there are for actually people who have some expertise in learning and instruction. Like, I'm not saying this is true across the board, but it is amazing to me, how many companies.
It is true.
I mean,
I'm gonna go out there.
You prey on the anxiety of people.
Exactly. Yeah. But the thing is, like, then they have these like cult followings, and it's like they're not on your team. This company is not looking out for you. Like, you do not need to be loyal to them. If you stop paying the money, they're not going to care about you. You know, like, so I'm going to go out and just say that it is actually, I think, across the board. I've been working with edtech companies, software companies around, B2C for learners, as well as for learning and development and training programs, e-learning design, LMS design. I can think of maybe 3 companies total where they actually had someone on the team that actually knew an amount that I think is ethically responsible for the product that they're designing. A lot of people have placed people that have the position, but they know shockingly little about the research beyond what, like, even just a typical YouTube, like a student would know from watching a few YouTube videos. It's terrible. And also I won't name names because I probably get sued for it, but I've had people that have contacted me ever since, like my personal brand has become a little bit larger. People, like software companies have been contacting me. I get a contact from a software company every month. And they're saying, like, can you, consult or whatever, or, be involved in some capacity. So when I talk to these companies and I pitch to them and I just say, like, I can work with you. However, if I have a recommendation, it's going to be based on what's going to be best for the learner. Like, yes, I'm going to have commercial viability in mind because on my other half, I do see myself as an entrepreneur. So I do understand the idea of having to run a business. And I believe that you can have an ethical private education business without, like, compromising on the quality. But when I say that, I've only ever had one company agree. That is to say that out of principle, these companies aren't willing to change their product if it's going to hurt their bottom line or their top line. Like, they're not going to be willing to make changes for the benefit. They're not even willing to hear it out. They're not even willing to do the consultation if that is the risk that it involves. I mean, that tells you a lot about their values.
The problem is that everything is done the wrong way around. So rather than like understand the need, really dig deep into the research and kind of create a product that fits a student's need or population's need. They start out with a product that maybe was developed for some other reason. That then they're trying to find a fit. They're trying to find something to do with this product so that they can make money. And so then it gets slipped into, say, the learner space, or sometimes the language learning space, or whatever. And it's and in some cases it's like, this isn't the absolute worst thing you can do, but the product, like, you're selling it. I mean, you're way overselling it by saying, well, it's going to do all these things, and it's really not a complete system at all. And the other thing is that, like, as you say, if you would, you could change the product to make it more effective for students, but that requires actual work, right, to change the product. And your whole, like, if you change the product, like, your whole the idea that you have been selling. Now, I mean, this is something that I talk about in some of my other videos, right? To sell a product in a lot of these cases in the learning space, you have to sell ideas, right? Like you have to sell that spaced repetition systems actually work. If that is what you're selling, right? You have to sell that brain training programs are going to improve your brain, if that's what your program is. And so it's the idea that you are selling. And so if you change the product to suit the learners kind of more effectively, then that whole marketing spiel is gone. That whole like, and you have to admit, like, that wasn't the right thing to do. But rather than come at it initially and kind of grow as you learn more stuff, which is what I would want to see companies do. It's kind of like, they have a specific product, they have a specific brand, they position themselves in a specific way, and they're not going to change.
Yeah, and there's no accountability for it. Who's going to punish them for it?
There is not. And this is something that is, it comes up. Man, I'm making a video on speed reading right now, and it's like, seeing people talk about speed reading, it makes me so angry, because it's just a lie, in the sense that, like, if you are a good reader, you can't read effectively beyond a certain speed. And to some degree, the whole point of reading is to digest the material and understand it deeply. But people, users will try to use it, and they'll be like, oh, hey, like now I'm reading X amount fast, with quote unquote no loss in comprehension. It's like, you don't even know what comprehending something would mean. Like there is no test for comprehension that you've given yourself. And you would have no idea if you did lose any comprehension, because you have to choose, right? Like there's no control group for you. So anyhow.
Yeah, I've actually got a video on like the idea of reading as well. And people are often asking me to make a video on speed reading and things like that. And the line is always, that's not where your rate limiter is. I mean, unless you really are struggling with the language, I think to a certain point, being able to read faster has good returns on it. But at a certain point, and that point is usually very low, like I'd say anything beyond 150 words per minute, you're getting very diminishing returns on being able to actually, for high level text. I mean, it's different if you're reading something very easy, then sure, you get more returns out of it. But at a certain point, the limiter is certainly just the ability to process the information in your brain and do something with it, rather than the ability to take in information, which is just, so these people that are like, oh, I read this book in like, one day. And it's like, cool. Well, I mean, it's kind of meaningless, but you can just pat yourself on the back, I guess, because you fulfilled a word count. But yeah. But people understand it easily. They know, like, speed reading, oh, I know what that means. And so, yeah. Anyway.
It sounds really simple, but everyone forgets it. Generally speaking, you want to practice the skills that you want to get better at. If you're studying a language, having a conversation with someone in the target language that you are studying involves retrieval. That is a retrieval-based practice. Most of the stuff we learn in school is about applying information. It's about understanding things. It's about flexibly using concepts in new situations. If the retrieval practice that you're doing doesn't involve these things, you got problems. It's like playing t-ball all your life and expecting that you are going to suddenly get good at baseball. Now, there's not a lot of studies that directly compare, say, encoding methods to retrieval methods. This, however, is a really good example. And just to show you the results here, this is two kinds of different tests. We've got concept mapping, which is a version of elaborative encoding. And we've got retrieval practice, which is a version of...
So this is quite a... well, I don't know if it's actually so heavily cited, but I feel like it's a well-known study, because like you say, it is one of the rare ones that look at a form of encoding compared to the retrieval. And the problem that I always had with this and the findings from it, which I think that the authors kind of mentioned, but they don't really like make it as big of a thing, is that the actual method that's used and the ability to ensure the accuracy of that method at a cognitive level, which is realistically speaking almost impossible to actually standardize without having very significant, rigorous training and examination to, tested competency beforehand. The effect is going to be like, massive. Like the difference is going to be massive. So one of the things that I say, and this is the reason why I always teach retrieval practice first with people that are untrained, if you're starting from a baseline where you've got relatively low metacognition and insight and relatively low level of either inherent deep processing, just innate ability because of your genetics or random upbringing or whatever it is, or you're not very familiar with higher order learning or higher order thinking, you always start with retrieval, because the learning curve for doing retrieval practice correctly is pretty low. Like even higher order retrieval practice techniques are pretty easy to do in terms of the technique. Now, it might be difficult to be able to do it successfully. For example, a very high order retrieval practice that requires you to, synthesize, highly integrative pieces of information. You might struggle with actually doing that, but the actual method of engaging in that practice, you'd do it correctly. The difficulty would be in that you just actually can't retrieve the knowledge, and that's kind of like the whole point, right? Just to figure that out.
That's okay.
Yeah, so that's good. But the actual technique fidelity, I guess some people would say germane load, is relatively like good there. However, with something like correct encoding principles and correct encoding methods, number one, there's not as much research by far. And also the number of sort of micro decisions that need to be made correctly and the amount of self-regulation that is required to execute on that is much, much, much more varied. And so like we're finding that there are some students in our program that can get it in, let's say, 2 or 3 months. But that's 2 or 3 months of like pretty rigorous calibrated training. Some people will struggle with that for over a year in the same process, due to so many different variables. So the issue that I have with this paper is that I think it does underestimate the complexity of getting the encoding thing right in the first place.
I mean, this is something that comes up in learning and teaching in general, and a lot of other research areas too. But there's a lot of different things that you could call an encoding approach, or a lot of different approaches to elaboration. And for the, in most cases, if you are running a single kind of study, as you say, you have to kind of collapse all of these decisions to choose kind of one thing, even if there's like 100 decision points, right? You've got to make all those decision points and say, okay, well, we're testing this thing. And I think, I mean, you mentioned, well, you had mentioned it in your video about how it's like, flashcards are kind of better than doing absolutely nothing, but are they the best thing possible? No. And in the same way, researchers kind of have this choice about, do you try to test something that people actually do, or do you try to test kind of the best version of this thing that you can think of? And this comes up with, say, like in some of the research on like active learning, where any departure from like straight up lecturing to people pretty much improves their learning. Like if there's any kind of questioning, any kind of interaction, any kind of problem solving, any kind of thing, like as long as you don't completely mess it up, but it makes, and that's a comparison that is like, well, everyone does lectures, even like online courses. They're just more video lectures. Everything is video lectures these days. And so it's like, well, do you compare it to the things that people actually do? And do you try to push the envelope that way? Or do you say, well, let's make a really meaningful comparison, which might be here. Like, actually, I got, one of your students came in and was like, yeah, like that's not how Justin does encoding. So that, if you did it the way that Justin does it, then the differences would be much smaller, or you would see how strong the encoding is. And it's like, yeah, it's entirely possible. I think that's like, it's a choice that this researcher makes, and this is like this is the thing where I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like distinguishes you and me and maybe some of the other people from who are research oriented. So it's like the answer to this isn't just throw this research away, doesn't matter. The answer is more research, right? Like it is a like it's like, oh, okay, if we, when you're standing on kind of the corners of practice and research, and it's like, well, hey, like this is why we identify research gaps. This is why people do more research, is because it's like, hey, they found this in this study, but I don't think that's quite right. They didn't use a super effective, concept mapping or mind mapping technique, and like, let's test a different technique and see if we could, you could keep all the protocols the same and basically test a different technique. And personally, I think that would be an interesting contribution to the research.
One interesting thing that I feel is that the effects of retrieval practice are essentially always effective. The effectiveness of it scales with the quality of the knowledge structure that you've got access to. So if you have a very weak knowledge structure that's fairly isolated, then your ability to actually do sort of the higher order types of retrieval practice sort of methods is somewhat restricted. Like, you can still do it, but you'd probably have to do it like multiple times to really be able to kind of push through each time. And it's very easy to get out of the scope of, I guess, the maximum benefit that you get for that time. So if you only have, like, let's say 1 hour to do a certain type of retrieval practice, and you want to do something that's higher order, but your knowledge structure is so weak that as soon as you start thinking that way, it's like, I just don't know. And you've just never thought about it that way. Then yes, you're able to start kind of, reinforcing that learning and supplementing it and strengthening it. And it will become stronger but then a lot of that time is spent on just creating a knowledge structure that you probably could have created to begin with without having to spend that additional hour just to figure out where those gaps are. And if you do the exact same thing again, let's say a week later, you'll find even more gaps. So you would push it out, but it requires more frequent and higher volumes of that retrieval. Whereas if you're able to kind of push out a reasonably good, well-integrated knowledge structure on the first bat, then when you do your retrieval practice, you're able to hone in on those smaller issues much faster, and you're able to consolidate at a wider level. And it means that the full range of sort of higher order all the way through to lower order retrieval practice methods is like very high yield and meaningful. And you're able to find those smaller gaps rather than just filling major foundational weaknesses. And I think this is exactly what happens in real practice, where people are doing practice exams or even not even doing practice exams properly. They'll sit an exam, and during the exam, that is the first time they've ever tried to think about it in a certain way. And they leave the exam thinking, man, I actually learned a lot from that. I just don't feel like that's a good feeling to have after finishing an exam. Like, I don't think you should finish an exam being like, man, I learned so much about this topic, you know? Like, you'd hope that that had already been done. Like, you pushed yourself beyond that before the exam. But actually, that's a very common experience that a lot of students have.
I remember doing, I was taking math classes in undergrad, and I was very lazy, and so I wouldn't do the homework. And then the exams were kind of like, oh, this is really challenging. This is really good, you know, because I don't, you know, like, I don't really know what I'm doing. And so I have to kind of like figure things out during the exam, which that is not a good thing to do if you want to get high grades and really deeply understand something. You would like to be taking those exams before the real exam, you know. I think one point that maybe dovetails with what you're saying is that the longer you wait, and this is something that in this particular paper was not, you know, it was basically like study the material, then immediately do the thing, right? Which, you know, I'm not even sure if say you would, I mean, I don't know if you call what they call retrieval practice. Like, would you call it encoding if you immediately read something and then you close the book and you sit and you try to remember what you read, or kind of try to create some structure out of what you read, like that? Yeah, like, but there's also this this time lag that's not being manipulated here. That is like, if you were, you know, obviously, and this is where the kind of research on spacing comes up, is like, if you let things go really, really far, and then you try to retrieve something that you barely understood very well and you forgot most of, that's not going to be a very effective way of, you know, of kind of, yeah, it's like, yeah, you can recognize the gaps and then you go back again and then you do it all again. There is a kind of sweet spot there, or there are sweet spots kind of along the journey.
Yeah, that immediate retrieval thing is kind of, I think thankfully we don't really see it as much in the more recent research. Like, retrieval practice spacing nowadays, I think the trend is that people are trying to space things out in a more realistic way. Like, they are looking at slightly longer periods of time, and there's less of those lab studies where you're being tested on it like 1 minute later versus 1.5 minutes later. And it's like, you know, we're phasing out of that thing, which I think is good to see. Anyway, let's jump back into this.
You don't have to choose between encoding and retrieval. You can do both. Encoding is really important, and you want to do that effectively. Retrieval is also really important, and you want to do that effectively. And for both of these activities, you want to be focused on the higher level thinking skills that Justin is talking about in his video. Go check out Justin's channel.
Learning is legitimately really, really complicated.
And you can see more videos on all the topics I talked about in the description below. See you next time.
Awesome. Well,
sorry, I had to pull that quote because that was like my favorite quote from your video, which is just like, learning is complicated.
Learning is complicated.
It's a lot more complicated than people think.
Yeah, a lot more complicated than people think. My favorite, I mean, I do like Instagram Live and TikTok Live sort of things, and someone's always like, "What's the best learning technique?" It's like, how do I answer that question? But anyway, you know, this has been a great discussion. Benjamin, thanks for being on here and having this, you know, very deep, comprehensive. But for some people, especially people that are watching my channel and part of your channel as well, have the mind and the interest to want to explore these topics a little bit further. So, you know, I think it's a valuable discussion to have. I like the fact that we've got this and we've got it and we're able to push it out there for all of you that are watching this right now. Make sure to check the description below. Check out Benjamin's channel, check out the other videos, make sure to subscribe. You know, one of the few people that I think are taking that real critical approach to education responsibly. So I think definitely worth checking out. But thanks everyone for watching. If you've got any questions about any of the concepts that we talked about today, just chuck them in the comments below and we'll have a look through them. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in and we'll see you next time.